Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is an innovator interview, and I'm really excited today to be talking with Reggie Ferreira, Associate Director of the Traumatology Institute at Tulane University's School of Social Work in New Orleans, Louisiana. Dr. Ferriera has been involved in research and writing about how communities recover from natural disasters. And we invited him here today to talk with us about the impact of climate change as a source of social, psychological, and economic pressure that's changing the way that we feel and respond to the world. Dr. Ferriera, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Let's, as we were speaking just before the show, understanding that the scope of climate change is awfully difficult. It's described by some folks as a hyperobject, an idea so big with so many different interfaces to our lives that we can't take it all in. But I think the way that many people are beginning to experience climate change is pretty plain, and that is through disaster. Now, you went to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and participated in the recovery efforts there. Tell us what happens to people when climate destroys their lives or their livelihood.
Mitch, that's a great question. One of the aspects associated with climate change is really the unknown. And just from a pure psychological standpoint, the unknown can cause stress and distress. So if that factor is added in and compounded with disaster, just the unknown creates extra stress. And then if one was to add in, like loss of livelihood, your loss of being, loss of culture, a sense of helplessness, that does create extra stressful situations that then leads on to further system stresses, like your personal interactions with colleagues, family members, with community members. That then leads to other aspects, from an individual standpoint, where someone might be experiencing depression down the road. There might be triggers that could create PTSD. So, it becomes very complex, especially with the climate change angle that's being added in, we've experienced.
Now, you obviously live in New Orleans and suffered the impact of Katrina, 14 years ago now.
Yes.
I've visited the city several times since then. It's striking to see the evidence of the flood still, but how have people changed in the community? Are they pulling together more, or do you see that their interactions are actually diminished as a result of those kinds of weather-related catastrophes that can just come out of nowhere?
I think with New Orleans, it's very unique, what was experienced with Katrina. And Katrina is actually being used now as a point of reference, the city before Katrina, the city after Katrina. And yes, there was loss of life, which was very unfortunate, but a lot of folks have actually used New Orleans as sort of a rising phoenix syndrome, where the disaster happened, but there was a lot of positive that came out of it. And one of the aspects has been, the community pulling together. It's a very unique situation here where, the disaster is being used as a catalyst for pulling together the community initiatives that's taken place. There's also been more value I've personally seen that's been put on culture, the value of music and healing.
And how would you contrast that with what you saw in Puerto Rico after Maria? I mean, because of course now we have more than a decade to digest Katrina, and New Orleans has digested it, as New Orleans digests many things with gusto.
Yes.
But Puerto Rico is still struggling to recover from Maria. What's it like on the ground, and what kinds of psychological stress did you see when you were working with people?
I think one of the main aspects or the differences with Hurricane Maria is really that it's an island. What happened, Puerto Rico is an island, so there's a form of isolation as well. There's also several policies, that prohibits services coming in, in terms of, not services, goods coming in onto the island, the Jones Act. So that has also really created a lot of distrust. Also the current political situation, they've had a change in governor, I believe 3 governors in a short time span of less than 2 weeks. So there is distrust in that regard. But the community has banded together. I've experienced quite a bit of social capital, where folks are tapping into local community resources. But at the end of the day, if you don't have access to external resources in terms of disaster recovery, it can hamper overall disaster recovery, but it does play into your psychosocial well-being, that sense of, when am I going to receive government assistance? And as we know, the current administration, US administration, did delay funding of several projects in Puerto Rico, which has been very unfortunate and has really delayed overall service delivery on the island.
And how would you characterize, from a psychological perspective, the challenge of living in a time when we cannot anticipate with confidence disaster, but we know that in a region like the Caribbean or the Gulf Coast, that it's almost inevitable. It's just you're never sure when. It's almost like knowing you're going to lose your job, but not knowing what day it will happen. How do people deal with that? What kind of services are available to somebody to help them cope with that rising uncertainty?
You're spot on. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when folks will experience, extreme climatic events like hurricanes. And just given the impact of climate change, we've seen these hurricanes become more intensified and the devastation is much worse, so I think that is on the surface level, people understand that. But yeah, just overall, I think there is a disaster subculture that's taking place. So disaster subculture is when regions experience disaster over time and they adapt accordingly. But obviously more preparedness is needed, more services needed, just resources being ready and folks knowing which resources to tap into. I know that's a very macro abstract idea in terms of resources, but just being prepared, on a household level, knowing where you can go, your evacuation routes you can take, which service providers you can reach, having a plan in place. And then
on meeting points, knowing you'll connect with your family.
Yes. And then in terms of what communities can do, and especially local governments, is just being prepared and having inventories of what resources are available. And if one was to look at more sort of the medical field, the mental health field, licensed clinical social workers and psychologists should know where to refer people as it relates to disaster services post-disaster, but even pre-disaster, when they meet with someone, inform them, or ask them, are you ready? We're in hurricane season. But what we're experiencing now is, and it's not to be grim, we see events outside of hurricane season, with tropical storms or just freak events that's taking place. So
now, my own father is a community psychologist who traveled to New Orleans after the hurricane and helped people. Do you see the psychological community beginning to organize itself around this idea of special forces teams that can drop in and help in a community that has been impacted by a disaster? Is that becoming a part of the business of being a psychologist?
I believe so. I definitely believe so. I think the urgency is being picked up on. There's several initiatives taking place, in the US and globally, in terms of having mental health services available post-disaster. But, if one was to remove the disaster piece, mental health services are already undertapped, there's not enough services available. So in times of disaster, those services are even stretched more. But yeah, there is definitely initiatives taking place. At Tulane University, we're working on a climate change adaptation for mental health. The American Psychological Association is also currently working on several climate change related initiatives.
Can you give us an example of one to help our listeners understand what those initiatives might look like?
So like on our end at Tulane, we're actually working on a book project where we are working with different communities where there's actually going to be case studies associated with our project. So like, for instance, we have the Isle de Jean tribe here in Louisiana, which is, per my knowledge, the first recognized climate change refugees that will need to relocate. But some of our other initiatives that will be associated with the book is like a hands-on approach, for practitioners, for scholars, how to identify symptoms related to climate change. And then actually, don't want to say paint my numbers guide, but a step-by-step guide how you can then actually assist individuals, households, and communities in addressing climate change. But it comes back to the main notion of being prepared for the next event.
So education and essentially pre-networking to make sure that people are connected and know where and how to tap into services if something happens is probably the best way to help reduce that constant sort of grinding uncertainty that we were talking about a moment ago.
Yes, correct. That's really the way to go, and building some of these networks, actually, the only thing it costs is your time and probably, data on your mobile phone or sending an email or calling up and establishing these networks. So, it does take time to establish it, but it's actually to an extent free, to establish these networks that folks can tap into post-disaster. But one thing I think we can definitely do a better job with is, especially for our folks who has English as a second language. I mean, like, for instance, myself, English is not my first language, but just if I take the event we've had recently here in New Orleans, what a hard time we're having finding Spanish-speaking disaster mental health volunteers, so catering for everyone, not just being English specific with the services we deliver.
Well, and then there's another group that can be impacted even more terribly, and that's the mentally ill. If they're cut off from the treatment or from the medication that they've been receiving. And we know that mental illness it's not a crisis in the sense that it's exploding everywhere. It's that it is treated and literally on the streets. How can communities, and this, I've never experienced a hurricane. I have, however, been under a volcanic eruption, which I never expected to happen in my life, and had the world shut down for an entire week. How can we help in our own communities prepare to support the community of mentally ill folks who might be on the street as we prepare to move into this unfortunate era?
One thing is definitely to work with service providers, educating our first line responders in terms of our mental health professionals, how they should go about treating folks with mental illness within a disaster context. And it comes just back to the basic notion of planning appropriately and knowing what resources can be tapped into or being brought in the case of a disaster. If one was to look at the homeless, that does become a little bit more tricky, for instance, providing services post-disaster. Mm-hmm. But, that's where shelters can also provide the needed services. And, great allies are like the American Red Cross that can provide services in terms of their volunteers. They've got a pretty strong volunteer basis. But, just to come back to the main notion is prepared accordingly, have a plan and action, and be inclusive with the planning. It's almost like plan for everything, expect the worst.
Well, yeah, and by including folks, they can talk it through, and the uncertainty is reduced by the talking through, as well as the sense of preparedness can give them greater resolve in the face of the crisis when it actually arrives. It's also interesting. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I couldn't have said it better. By talking through certain aspects of, the unknown, you're actually addressing some of the stress, what can be expected, So, yeah, you're spot on. Couldn't have said it better.
Well, as I mentioned at the outset, this notion that climate change is something that is so big we can't really address it in one simple way. As you were talking about the support systems for the mentally ill that can be in place all the time, but then could potentially even be extended to support other members of the community in a crisis. The investment in, and I'm actually asking for your opinion of this idea, the investment in the services, the shelters and the like could be extended to the rest of the community at a crisis moment. And the short-term result is an improvement in overall mental health.
Yes, definitely. And folks might actually tap into these services, and they might find out that they've had an issue, and they can address it accordingly. So sometimes you don't know a problem until you've identified you have a problem.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, You do a number of different fascinating things, including serving as the editor of Traumatology, which is the American Psychological Association journal on disaster and trauma. What would you say the most important thing our listeners can take away today and apply in their community is of the kinds of programs we've been talking about? What would you suggest if somebody wanted to make a change in their community they do today?
Well, there's great ways, several communities have got, if we start out on the community level, have organizations working in the disaster preparedness space. There's the American Red Cross, there's Team Rubicon, the veteran service organization that folks can join in and tap into to be part of the change movement. Organizations like the American Red Cross also offer trainings for folks, in terms of disaster preparedness, disaster mental health preparedness. And then if we were to move from the community to the household, definitely ensure that everyone's informed, about the risks a community might face. Oftentimes households move into communities and they might not even be aware, that this community might experience flooding or a hurricane, or, might be in tornado alley or even in an earthquake zone, So that's one thing, is be aware of your risks, but then plan accordingly to address those risks if you were to experience disaster. And then from an individual level standpoint, again, it's simplistic, it's tangible. You can have what is referred to as the go bag, where you pack your supplies that you might need during time of disaster. But just in general, having awareness, if you have children in the household, educate them accordingly, and do it in such a fashion that you don't create anxiety or stress. But again, there's great resources available online, through organizations like UNICEF, the American Red Cross have got resources where parents and caregivers can actually interact with children accordingly to raise their awareness and overall disaster preparedness.
And I think our kids are the ones who are ultimately going to force us to come to terms with this. And it's important that we not stress them too much as we deal with it. But it's going to be quite a change. And it's been fascinating to talk to you about this. Dr. Reggie Ferreira is the Associate Director of the Traumatology Institute at Tulane University School of Social Work. Dr. Ferreira, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, this has been another episode of Earth911 Sustainability in Your Ear, an innovator interview, and we will be back with another episode soon. Have a great day, folks.